Sign here, sweetheart. And here at the bottom. You don't need to read it, it's just a formality. Leave her be, Grant. The girl never understood paperwork anyway. Why confuse her with it? See, my mother's right. You just put your pretty signature down and we'll handle the rest. Like always, I'd rather read it. Maggie, I said I'd rather read it. It's a single page. 13 years together and you still don't trust me. I don't distrust you, Grant. Counselor, would you please tell him that this is nothing that a husband doesn't ask his wife to sign something that hurts her? Then you shouldn't mind if I read the whole thing. The attorney cleared his throat and glanced at Grant. Grant looked at his mother, and in that triangle of glances, there was an entire conversation Maggie wasn't invited to. She already had the page in her hand. She held it with both, not because her pulse trembled, but because that was how she handled anything she truly wanted to understand, steady, close to the light, the way you hold a page up to the sun to check whether a stain is mold or just shadow. The office smelled of cold coffee and expensive leather. Outside, 30 floors below, the financial district was deep in its Monday traffic. Inside, 3 people waited for a woman to finish reading a page they'd sworn said nothing. It said plenty. Maggie read slowly. Her lips moved just slightly, a habit from her father who used to read grape contracts the way other men prayed. The first time the word parcel appeared, she paused. The second time, her eyes lifted half an inch. The third time, she went very still. It says here that I transfer. She looked up. That I transfer full rights to the Calloway Ridge parcel to Sinclair Sellers LLC. It's an accounting formality, the attorney said in the smooth voice of a man who's explained this 1,000 times to women who don't understand these things. The parcel already operates as part of the winery. This just puts it on paper properly. It regularizes a situation that honestly should have been settled years ago. That land belongs to my father. The land, with all due respect, belonged to your father. Your father passed away, and for years now it's functioned as part of the company's holdings. Signing this doesn't take anything from you. It takes away a headache. Grant leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his stomach, those manicured hands of a man who hadn't touched dirt in a very long time. He smiled with the patience of someone who's already won and is just waiting for the other person to notice. Maggie, baby, we've been at this all morning. We have the lunch with the distributors at 1. It's 1 page. She lowered her eyes to the paper again, not to reread it, but so she wouldn't have to look at any of them while she thought, because when she really thought, something in her face drifted somewhere else, and she didn't want to give them that. I'll take it with me, she said. I'll read it at home calmly and bring it back signed on Thursday. Thursday, the attorney's out. Then Friday. And there, Grant's voice dropped 1 degree. Just 1. The exact degree where affection turns into a warning. Don't make this complicated. You've never made things complicated. Don't start now. Eleanor let out a long sigh, the same sigh she'd been sighing for 13 years, the one that said, without saying it, I warned my son about this. She adjusted the silk scarf at her neck, the gesture of a dethroned queen who was never queen of anything but her own living room. Let her take it, Grant. Let her read it. Let her consult whoever she wants. She looked at Maggie over the rim of her glasses, and in that look was a lifetime of arithmetic already done. In the end, she'll sign. She always signs. The girl knows which side her bread is buttered on. Maggie folded the page in 3 a clean fold, the fold of someone from ranch country who knows how to fold a feed sack. She tucked it into her bag. Good morning, she said, and walked out of the office, without hurrying, in the heels Grant had bought her, and that she'd never quite learned to walk in, feeling, on her back, the weight of 3 pairs of eyes that believed her defeated, and for that very reason weren't watching her closely enough. Alone in the elevator, Maggie took the page back out and read the line again. Transfers full rights to the Calloway Ridge parcel. She didn't know the law. She never needed to. But she knew the land that line named so casually, the way you'd name an old piece of furniture that's in the way. She knew every acre of it. She knew which rows got the morning sun and which got shade where the frost bit first. In which corner had her father knelt down 40 years ago and planted the very first vine, telling her 6 years old at the time that a vineyard isn't inherited, it's earned. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto marble and plants someone watered under contract. Maggie put the page away. She didn't sign that day, and that was the first thing in 13 years she'd done differently. She hadn't folded up and tucked away an irritation to avoid causing a scene. She'd folded up and tucked away a question. Why was her husband in such a hurry for land he already used however he pleased to suddenly appear on paper under his name and not hers? She didn't have the answer, but for the first time in a long while she wanted one. The drive from San Francisco to Napa Valley was highway and silence, and Maggie made it with her forehead against the window, while Grant, 2 seats over, answered emails and laughed on the phone with someone from the office. She didn't confront him in the car. She'd learned early in the marriage that arguing in a closed space with an audience nearby just handed Grant the scene he needed to make her the problem. Her husband had a talent. He could turn any complaint of hers into proof that she was tense, tired, exaggerating, difficult. So Maggie didn't complain. She stored it away the way you store pruned branches for the winter fire. They reached the estate as the sun was going down. Calloway Ridge looked different at that hour when the light came in sideways through the rows and hit the vines with a green they never had at noon. Maggie got out of the car and breathed. That smell. Dry earth, wild sage, the first dampness of night rising from the ground gave her back something the condo in the city, with its air conditioning and its expensive candles, never gave back. The farmhouse was beautiful pale stone, tall cypress trees lining the gravel drive, an entry arch her father had built with a local mason and 2 mules. Now it was the backdrop for the label photography. Now it appeared in wine magazines under Grant's name. Sinclair Cellars, the vision of one man. That's what a reporter had called it last year in an 8-page feature where Maggie was mentioned once, in parentheses, as his wife who supports him. She'd made that wine with her own 2 hands. But hands don't sell magazines the way a good tie does. Heading to the barrel room, Grant said, already getting out of the car, already back on the phone. Camille sent over some samples from the new lot. I want to taste them before tomorrow's dinner. Camille, the new sommelier. I introduced you at the harvest party. Marketing girl, very sharp. Fresh brings good ideas. He shut the car door. Don't wait up for dinner. I'll probably be a while with the samples. And he walked off toward the barrel room with the quick step of a man heading somewhere he's expected and welcomed. Maggie stood in the gravel with her bag on her shoulder, the folded page inside it, watching her husband's back disappear among the cypress trees. She didn't think anything shaped like suspicion in that moment. The thought was older and simpler. When was the last time he told me I brought fresh ideas? She went inside, took off her heels at the door, as always, and walked barefoot across the clay tile floor her mother had had put in tile. No expensive renovation of Grant's had ever managed to talk her out of. She put water on for tea, and while it heated, she took the page out of her bag and set it on the kitchen table under the light and read it a 3rd time. Transfers full rights to the Calloway Ridge parcel to Sinclair Cellars LLC. There was a word that hadn't landed properly back in the office, with the rush and the stairs. Alone now, she felt its full weight. Property, of the heading read. Property of. Transferred by Margaret Calloway Sinclair to the company. My property his, but the land was his, the land was hers, her father's Robert Calloway, who'd bought it acre by acre back when the valley was still dust and nobody would bet a nickel on that grape. Grant had come along later. 13 years later, with a good suit, a business plan, and a smile that at 29 had looked to Maggie like the future. Grant built the brand, the distributors, the ambition, put his name on the door. But the land underneath all of it was still Calloway land. Or was it? Maggie stood still with the mug in her hand because suddenly something uncomfortable occurred to her. She didn't know, not with the certainty of paper whose name that land was actually under. In 13 years, she'd never checked. She'd signed whatever was put in front of her. Board resolutions, powers of attorney capital increases with the naive faith of a woman who loves and trusts and also, as her mother-in-law liked to say, never understood paperwork. She'd signed so much at so many desks that she no longer knew what she'd signed. And that was the second thing she folded and tucked away that day. No longer an irritation, no longer a question, a small alarm the size of a cricket that started ringing somewhere in the back room of the house. And this time she didn't shut it off. The water boiled. Maggie poured it without looking. Outside, night fell over the vineyard and the lights in the barrel room stayed on, and from over there faint came a laugh that wasn't Grant's. A young woman's laugh, short, followed by his voice, low in that tone Maggie recognized, because once, years ago, it had been meant for her. She didn't go down to the barrel room. She sat at the clay table with her tea and the folded page and decided, without quite admitting it to herself, that she wasn't signing anything until she understood exactly what she was signing. Never again, even if it cost her a scene, even if they painted her as difficult, as tense, as the one who ruins the distributor lunch. There was a box in the room that had been her father's study, a wooden box, with the winery's old brand burned into the lid where Robert Calloway kept what he called the real papers. She'd never opened it without him. After he died, she'd closed it and carried it up to the attic and never looked at it again, because opening it hurt, and because she'd never needed to. Now she needed to. Maggie climbed to the attic that same night with a flashlight, still barefoot, and searched through the dust and cobwebs for her father's wooden box. It took effort to move. It was heavy the way things are heavy when you've stopped carrying them for a long time. She brought it down, set it on the table, and rested her hand on the lid for a moment, feeling the burned brand under her fingers before opening it. Inside was a man's whole life reduced to paper. The deed to her grandparents' house, her parents' marriage certificate, a bundle of letters tied with string, and underneath, wrapped in a plastic sleeve against the damp, a thick, folded document with a label in her father's uncertain handwriting. The Ridge. Ours. Not for sale, not to be lent, not to be given away. Maggie pulled out the document, peeled off the plastic, unfolded it under the flashlight with the same care her father used to unfold a grape leaf to check the underside. It was the deed to the Calloway Ridge parcel, and at the top where the owner's name goes, in old typewriter letters, it read a single name. Not Sinclair Sellers, not Grant, not the company, Margaret Elizabeth Calloway. Her. Her father hadn't left the land to the winery. He hadn't left it to his son-in-law either. He'd left it to her. Only to her. Dated 12 years earlier, 1 year before he died, when he already knew he was dying and still didn't fully trust the man with the good smile his daughter had brought home. Maggie sat down on the attic floor with the deed in her hands, the flashlight trembling slightly, and for the first time in a long while she felt her father in the room. Not as a sad memory, but as a warning that had taken 12 years to arrive, and arrived on exactly the right night. Don't ever give it up, he'd told her once, a little drunk at harvest when she was 20 and in love with some boy she couldn't even remember now. The land is the one thing that never betrays you, my girl. People do. The land doesn't. She'd laughed back then. She wasn't laughing now. She put the deed back in its plastic sleeve, but she didn't return it to the box. She took it downstairs with her, tucked it between the pages of a pruning manual Grant would never in his life open, and put the book back exactly where it had always sat in plain sight. What's the best place to hide something from a man who thinks he already knows everything? Then she went down to the kitchen, washed her mug, turned off the light, and standing by the window in the dark, watched the lights of the barrel room still burning. And the small alarm the size of a cricket turned into something else. It stopped ringing softly. It rang steady, now low, constant, like an engine you can't shut off because it's already running. Her husband wanted her to sign away land that was hers alone. The question wasn't why the rush anymore. The question was what came after that signature, what needed the land to stop being hers before it happened. And for the first time in 13 years of quiet compliance, Maggie Calloway decided she was going to find out. Quietly. No scenes. The way you check a sick vine leaf by leaf, without cutting anything, until you're sure where the rot is. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't cry either. She sat at the clay table until dawn, and when the sun came through the window and hit the folded transfer document, she no longer saw it as a trap. She saw it as the first clue. The distributor dinner was the next night. In the barrel room, the farmhouse lit up like a wedding. Grant was a different man on nights like that. Something lit up in him when there was an audience. He greeted guests at the entrance to the barrel room with a glass in hand and a story ready, and told for the 1,000th time how he'd built Sinclair Cellars from nothing with a vision and a drive nobody else had. The distributors nodded. They'd heard the story before, and they still liked it because businessmen prefer a good story to a complicated truth. Maggie stood at the far end of the long table serving, making sure the right glasses reached the right hands, that the red was at the right temperature, that the bread was warm. She played in her own house, on her own land, the role of invisible hostess, and she played it well because she'd had 13 years of practice. Camille stood to Grant's right, presenting the samples, talking about notes of dark fruit and silky tannins, the words young sommeliers learn, so wine sounds like poetry instead of labor. The distributors watched her, with the double attention men of a certain age give a young woman who also happens to know what she's talking about. And Grant watched her, watching them proud, the way you look at something you believe belongs to you. To this vintage, Camille said, raising her glass. A huge leap in quality. Grant made some very bold calls in the winemaking this year. Maggie, at the far end of the table, didn't look up from the bottle she was opening. She'd done the winemaking for that vintage alone, in the small hours of harvest, while Grant slept or traveled. The decision to lower the yield to wait 3 extra days for ripeness, despite the risk of rain to ferment the old row separately, all of it had come from her hands and her instinct. Camille called them Grant's bold calls, and Grant nodded and accepted the credit with the ease of a man who'd long ago forgotten there was ever a time lying cost him something. One distributor, though, didn't nod. He was the oldest one there, Frank Whitfield, from a winehouse up in Sonoma, a man with broad hands who'd been buying and selling for 40 years and had done business with Robert Calloway back when the valley was still dust. He tasted the wine, swirled it, smelled it with his eyes closed. No theater, with the seriousness of someone who actually knows. And instead of looking at Grant or Camille, he searched the far end of the table with his eyes. "This is from the old row," he asked toward Maggie, "the first one Robert planted, the stubborn one." A small silence fell. "Yes," Maggie said, "fermented separately. It's the backbone of the blend. You can taste it." Frank nodded slowly to himself. "That wine doesn't get bought. That wine gets inherited." He raised his glass just slightly, a small, private toast aimed only at her. "Your father would be proud, kiddo." Grant laughed to pull the table back to himself. Now, Frank, don't go filling my wife's head. She already thinks she owns the place." He said it like a joke, and the others laughed with him. "Decisions get made up top here. She just waters the plants." Everyone laughed except Frank, who lowered his eyes back to his glass, and except Maggie, who kept serving with a calm face, filing away, "She just waters the plants," in the same pocket where she kept everything that would someday be useful. At the end of the night, once the guests had left and Grant walked them to their cars, laughing, Maggie stayed behind, clearing glasses in the barrel room, and saw on the tasting table a key ring that wasn't hers or his. A key ring with a key to the barrel room and a key to the farmhouse. She picked it up. On the ring hung a small charm, a letter of pink enamel C. Camille had a key. To the house. Nobody had given it to her, not that Maggie knew of, not that Maggie had asked anybody about. Someone had had it made. Maggie set the key ring back down exactly where it had been so as not to give away that she'd seen it. She finished clearing the glasses, turned off the lights in the barrel room, and walked up to the house in the dark, crossing the gravel her father had laid, owner of a piece of land where a stranger came and went with her own key, and where she, the wife, had just been told in front of guests that she only waters the plants. She didn't go straight to bed. She sat back down at the clay table, and for a second night in a row she didn't shut off the little alarm in the back of the house. She let it ring because it didn't bother her anymore. Now she used it the way you follow the buzz of a bee to find the hive. The attorney's name was Laura Bennett, and she didn't practice in San Francisco. Maggie went looking for her far away on purpose, not at the firm Grant always used, not with Grant's lawyers, who were Grant's people, even though the company paid their bills. She found in Santa Rosa, in a modest building on a street with a pharmacy and a bakery, the name of a family attorney a woman from town, the one who sold her cheese, had given her years back for a cousin's matter. She'd kept it unused, the way she kept everything that might someday be useful. She showed up without an appointment on a Tuesday, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that wasn't hers and dark sunglasses, and felt ridiculous and understood at the same time that hiding wasn't ridiculous once you actually had something to hide. Laura Bennett was 60, gray hair cut short, and had a way of looking at you that didn't waste time. "Take off the glasses," she said, the moment Maggie sat down. "No sun in here. And if you're going to lie to me, you might as well leave. I'll charge you the hour either way, but we'll both have wasted our time." Maggie took off the glasses and set 2 documents on the desk, the folded transfer page and her father's deed with her name at the top. "I need to understand what this is," she said, "and I need it to not leave this room." Laura read the deed first, then the transfer, set them side by side, pulled a pair of reading glasses out of a drawer, one arm repaired with tape, and read again more slowly this time, pencil in hand, underlining. It took a good while. Outside the morning passed, a propane truck announcing itself, a dog barking. "Let's see if I've got this straight," Laura finally said, taking off the glasses. "This land, the vineyard, the one this deed calls Calloway Ridge, it's in your name, yours only, yours, inherited from your father. 12 years ago, before you got married under whatever marital regime you have, did you two marry with separate property or community property?" "Separate," my father insisted. It was the one thing Grant couldn't talk him out of. "Then your father was sharp." Laura tapped the deed with her finger. "Separate property means what was yours before the marriage and what you inherited stays yours. This land was never the company's, never your husband's. It's 100% yours. But the winery operates on it, all of it. The house, the barrel room, the vines. It operates there." Laura put her glasses back on and searched through the winery papers Maggie had brought. Old resolutions contracts Maggie had signed without reading for 13 years. "Let's see here. Look, here it is." She said, "There's a use agreement." "A what?" "A use agreement. A loan of the land, essentially. You, the landowner, loaned the use of it to the company for free, signed 8 years ago. They probably slid it in front of you with 10 other papers, and you signed thinking it was just another formality." Maggie said nothing. Yes, she'd signed it without reading, like everything. And here's the good part. Laura's pencil ran down the contract and stopped on a paragraph. Section 7. The loan agreement is revocable. The lender that you can terminate it by giving 90 days written notice. No cause required. No one's permission needed. She took off the glasses a second time and looked Maggie straight on. "Do you understand what this means, Mrs. Sinclair? Tell me." "It means the entire Sinclair Cellars empire. The whole thing. Your husband built the brand, the wine, the labels in the magazines, the distributors, the barrel room he shows off with such pride. All of it is physically standing on land that's yours, and you, with one letter and 90 days, can tell them to get off your property." She leaned back in her chair. "Your husband doesn't have a winery, Mrs. Sinclair. He has a borrowed winery. And he either doesn't know it or he does know it, and that's exactly why he's suddenly in such a hurry for you to sign this transfer." The cricket in the back of the house was a church bell now. Maggie sat looking at the 2 documents on the attorney's desk. Her father's land, her husband's trap. Side by side, like truth and lies, which on paper so often look so alike you have to read them twice to tell which is which. "There's something I don't understand," she said slowly. "If he knows the land is mine, why go 13 years without saying anything? Why does he suddenly need me to sign now? Laura looked at her for a long moment before answering with the gaze of someone who's seen a lot of divorces before the wives even knew they were getting divorced. Ma'am, that's not a legal question. That's a life question. She gathered the papers, squared them, handed them back. A man doesn't rush to get his affairs in order unless he's about to do something with them. Sell, split things up, or leave. She paused. Find out what your husband is about to do, and don't sign anything. Anything, even if they cry, even if they yell, even if they tell you you're ruining the lunch. From now on, you don't sign. You read. Understood. Maggie put the papers back in her bag and stood. Through the office window came the sound of the street, the ordinary life of people who hadn't discovered that morning that their marriage was a lease about to expire. Understood, she said, and that word which 2 days earlier in Grant's office had sounded like surrender, now in the modest Santa Rosa office sounded like something entirely different. It sounded like the first bolt loosening to the left. Slowly, patiently, because loosening was the hardest thing Maggie had known since childhood watching her father among the vines. Camille was 29, the same age Maggie had been when she met Grant. Maggie noticed that detail one afternoon without meaning to, watching the young woman lean over a glass in the barrel room, explaining something about tannins with her hands, and Grant listening with an attentiveness he hadn't given anything Maggie said in a long time. 29. The exact age when a woman still believes the man looking at her is looking at her and not at the young reflection of himself she's unknowingly handing back to him. Maggie didn't make a scene. She'd decided back in Laura's office that scenes were a luxury she could no longer afford. A scene would make her the problem again. She didn't need to be right out loud. She needed proof quietly. So she did what she did best in that house. She watched without letting it show that she was watching. She'd learned it with the vines. You don't cure a sick vine by ripping it out the moment you spot one yellow leaf. You observe. You check the underside of the leaves, the base of the trunk, the moisture in the soil. You gather information over days before cutting anything, because cutting too much kills the plant, and cutting too little leaves the disease alive. She started watching her husband with the eyes she used on a sick vine, and the yellow leaves appeared one after another, now that she knew where to look. Grant stayed at the vineyard on weeknights with new excuses. Camille brought up samples at hours nobody tastes samples. There was a perfume in the barrel room that wasn't barrel oak. There was on Grant's phone, which he used to leave lying around and now carried face down and locked, an entire life Maggie didn't need to open the phone to know about. She knew it by the shape of it, the way you know the size of a fruit under a leaf without picking it. But none of that was proof. A hunch doesn't revoke a use agreement. A perfume doesn't win a lawsuit. Maggie needed the other thing, the thing underneath the part buried below the surface of the matter, not in the leaves. And she found it in a place it would never occur to Grant to watch, because it was the one part of the house he considered beneath him, unworthy of his attention. The household books, the small accounts, the receipts, the domestic ledger kept by Ernie Walsh. Ernie was 74 and had started working for Robert Calloway when Calloway Ridge was still a hillside with goats on it. He'd been the foreman, then the estate manager, then the man who knew where every pipe and every old grudge on the property was buried. Grant kept him on out of habit, and because firing a loyal old man reads badly in magazine profiles, but he didn't listen to him, didn't really see him. To Grant, Ernie was part of the scenery like the cypress trees. Maggie went to see him one afternoon in his small office next to the barrel room with 2 coffees. No hat, no sunglasses, because she didn't have to hide from Ernie. "Miss Maggie," the old man said when he saw her standing up with that courtesy from another era. "How long has it been since you came down to this office?" "Too long, Ernie. I'm sorry." She set the coffee in front of him. "I'm here to ask you for something a little unusual and to ask you not to mention it to anyone." The old man sat back down, looked at her with those clear, tired eyes that had watched her father die and the winery grow, and suspected right then far more than either of them was saying. "You go ahead. I need to see the movements on the household account. The last 2 years, everything that's gone through it. You'll have it." Ernie didn't ask why. That was the old man's first gift. He didn't ask. He got up slowly, went to a metal file cabinet that creaked the way honest things creak, and pulled out a thick folder of bank statements organized by month, annotated in the margins in his old bookkeeper's hand. "It's all here, kiddo. I balance it every month even though nobody ever checks." He set the folder on the table. "You balance the books out of respect, not because someone's watching." Maggie opened the folder and there it was, the thing underneath. 14 transfers over 18 months, all to the same account, under a company she didn't recognize. Bishop Creative Group. Amounts that kept climbing. The first $4,000. The last, 3 weeks ago, $11,000. In total, when Maggie added it up with Ernie's pencil, when she added it again because she didn't believe it, $61,000. Pulled little by little from the household account under vague line items, consulting, image services, brand strategy, to a shell company. "Do you know what Bishop Creative Group is?" Maggie asked in a very calm voice. The voice she used when she wasn't calm at all inside. Ernie took his time, blew on his coffee, drank. "I don't know a thing, kiddo," he said. "I just balance numbers." And then, not looking at her, looking at the wall, he added, "But I'll tell you one thing I do know. That new girl, Camille, her middle name is Cross. Camille Bishop Cross, if I'm not mistaken. Bishop from her mother's side." He took another sip. "B and C, kiddo. B and C. Bishop and Cross. Look it up." Maggie closed the folder slowly. She didn't feel as she would have believed before that the world was collapsing. She felt the opposite. She felt the world finally leveling out. That the yellow leaves and the perfume and the face-down phone and the rush over the transfer document stopped being loose suspicions and settled into a single pattern clear as a well-planted row of vines. Her husband had a girlfriend. He'd set her up with a company. He'd funneled $61,000 of household money to her over 18 months. And now he wanted Maggie to sign away the land to the company, the one thing of value that was hers and not his, before he went ahead with whatever he was planning. "Can I get copies of these pages, Ernie?" The old man looked at her and something crossed his old face that wasn't surprise because he already knew everything, but relief. The relief of a man who's carried a dirty secret a long time and finally sees the right person come to take it off his hands. "Kiddo," he said, and his voice went rough. "I made copies of these 6 months ago, kept them in case you ever came asking." He opened another drawer, the bottom one, the one that locked, and pulled out an envelope. "Your father asked me one thing before he died. He said, 'Ernie, look after my girl, not from the thieves outside, from the ones inside.'" He put the envelope in her hands. "Forgive me for taking so long to give it to you. A man doesn't always know when a daughter's ready to find out she's being robbed in her own house." Maggie took the envelope. Her hand shook, just barely, a tremor the size of a grape leaf in the wind, and she controlled it, because in front of Ernie, she wasn't going to cry. She'd cry later, alone. And not out of sadness, out of that clean, cold anger that doesn't want to scream, it wants to plan. "Thank you, Ernie," she said, "for looking out for me and for looking out for him without telling me." "Don't thank me yet," the old man turned serious. "The worst is still ahead, kiddo, and you know it. A man who sets his girlfriend up in a company and asks his wife to sign away the land isn't planning to leave with a clear conscience. He's clearing the ground. To take everything. Be careful and don't sign anything even if they put the pen right in your hand and smile while they do it." That evening, Maggie went back to the farmhouse with the envelope under her arm. She tucked the bank copies inside the same pruning manual where her father's deed already slept. 2 pieces of evidence in one book Grant would never open. The land that was hers, the money he was stealing from the household for the other woman. She poured herself a glass of her own wine, made with her own hands, sold under his name, and went out to the porch to watch the vines go dark. Down in the barrel room, the lights were still on. Camille's laugh drifted up now and then, short, and Grant's voice behind it. Maggie didn't feel jealous. That was what surprised her most about herself that night. She searched for the jealousy inside the way you search for a loose tooth with your tongue, and didn't find it. She found something else, colder and far more useful. She found the end of respect, which is a thing that, once it's gone, doesn't come back, and which frees you more than it hurts. The last confirmation, the one that left no doubt at all, came a few nights later and came on its own without Maggie looking for it. She'd gone down to the barrel room late, for a bottle, barefoot, with the habit a whole life had taught her of moving without noise, of not wanting to disturb anyone. The barrel room door was half open, and inside there was light and voices. Maggie stopped in the stone hallway in the dark, hand against the cold wall, not because she decided to eavesdrop, but because the words she heard nailed her feet to the ground before she could think about leaving. "I'm telling you there's no problem," Grant was saying. "Once she signs over the parcel, we're off and running. The brand's already mine, the accounts are already where they need to be. All that's left is that signature, and if she doesn't sign Camille's voice without the poetry of tannins now." Dry, practical. "She'll sign," Grant laughed, with a confidence that chilled something inside Maggie out in the hallway. "Maggie signs whatever's put in front of her. Always has. It's how she feels loved, you know. You hand her a paper, you say trust me, and sign. 13 years hasn't failed once." "It feels wrong, Grant. She's your wife." A pause, the sound of a glass being set down. "It's going to be fine. Give me a few months. Once the land's in the company's name, the divorce is clean. She keeps what's hers, which is nothing because we married separate property, and we keep this." Another silence. "You won't want for anything. I already told you the city condo goes in your name next year. And she's sentimental, thinks that sorting out paperwork is going to sort out the marriage." He laughed again, and that laugh was the worst part of all. Worse than the transfers, worse than the key. "She actually asked me for time to think about us. I'll give her all the time in the world to think somewhere far away." Maggie didn't hear what Camille answered. She was already climbing the stairs slowly, without the bottle stepping at the edge of the treads so they wouldn't creak, her breathing even, her face still and inside, not a scream, but a clean, ordered cold running through her body from the back of her neck to her hands. She didn't cry on the stairs. She didn't stop to shake against the wall. She went up into her room, closed the door carefully, and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. And only then did she allow herself one thing. She pressed her fists onto her knees until her pruning callous fingernails bit into her palms, and held it in without a sound, the one tear that escaped her, and it wasn't grief, it was rage. And Maggie's rage didn't scream. Maggie's rage calculated. Signs whatever's put in front of her, always has. That sentence, said by her husband to another woman in her father's barrel room over her father's land, was the thing that finally settled everything. Not the affair, not the money. The absolute certainty in his voice that she was a compliant instrument, a signature with hands, someone who didn't need convincing, just pointing at the paper. She was going to sign. Yes, Grant was right about that. She was going to sign, but not what he thought. Her husband believed she couldn't live without him. He believed it so deeply with a certainty so old that he didn't even bother hiding the lit-up barrel room. Why would he? The girl never understood paperwork. The girl knows which side her bread is buttered on. The girl will sign. She always signs. Maggie drank her wine slowly, looking out at her father's land, the land in her name, the land she slept over without knowing it, holding up the entire empire of a man who believed her incapable. And for the first time since the office in San Francisco, she smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of a pruner who, after a long time watching, finally finds the exact branch that needs to come off so the rest of the vine can live. What was still left was the hardest part. What was left was to stop watching and start cutting. What Maggie learned over the following weeks, she didn't go looking for out of anger. She looked for it with method, which is far more dangerous. She learned at night, phone in hand, with a farmer's patience, what Laura's papers actually meant. She learned what an LLC was and how it gets emptied out. She learned that over the last 2 years, Grant had been moving not just the household money, but restructuring the winery itself. New loans in the company's name. Assets shifted to a separate entity where Camille Bishop Cross, 29 sommelier, appeared in a filing Ernie helped track down as a 15% partner. The plan, once Maggie had it complete, was almost elegant. She almost admired it the way a winemaker coldly admires a mold that knows exactly how to destroy a harvest. Grant was going to divorce her. Separate property, so on paper Maggie had no claim to the winery, which was held in the company's name only to whatever was hers from before the marriage. And what was hers from before was exactly the land, the one card she held, hence the transfer. If Maggie signed the transfer, the land passed to the company, and then in the divorce she'd walk away with nothing. No winery because it was never hers on paper, no land because she'd just signed it away. She'd leave 13 years of marriage with her clothes and her dignity, and Grant would keep everything, the brand, the land, the barrel room, the house, with Camille installed as the fresh new face of Sinclair Cellars. He had it all worked out, all of it except for one thing, that Maggie wasn't going to sign the transfer, and without that signature, his whole elegant plan stalled in the exact same place his entire winery stalled on land that wasn't his. Maggie understood it one early morning sitting at the clay table with Laura's papers, Ernie's copies, and her father's deeds spread out in front of her like a hand of cards she finally knew how to read. She'd stopped being the target of the plan. She'd become the owner of the trap, and that was the moment she stopped watching. She got up, made coffee, and while the sky began to lighten over the vines, made the hardest decision of her 13 years of marriage, which wasn't to leave, or to scream, or to press charges. It was something far quieter and far stronger. She decided she was going to let him win on paper to his face at the distributor lunches. She was going to be, for a few more weeks, the girl who always signs the compliant wife who doesn't understand business. She was going to let Grant believe right up to the last second that he was the smartest man in the room. Because the only way to prune without the tree fighting back is to prune while the tree still thinks you're watering it. That morning, when Grant came down to breakfast, smelling of the cologne she no longer bought him, he found her in the kitchen with 2 eggs and a coffee and a smile he mistook for her usual one. "You know what Maggie said?" setting his plate in front of him. "I was thinking about the parcel." Grant looked up carefully the way you look up when you're braced for an argument. "You're right, it's a headache keeping it separate." She sat across from him, buttered her toast, didn't look at him too much, because lying is like tuning an engine. It goes better with your hands busy. "I'll sign whenever you want. Tell the attorney to draw everything up. I just didn't want to sign in a rush in the city. You know how I am." "But I thought about it. You're right." Grant looked at her a second too long, and in that second, Maggie knew that her husband, who believed her simple, wasn't entirely simple either, and that some part of him faintly suspected something didn't add up with all this compliance. Then he did the only thing he could do to erase that suspicion. He poured himself more coffee with a steady hand and said without making it sound important, looking out the window toward the barrel room, "I just want to ask you one thing. Once everything's settled, I want to go stay with my aunt for a few days by myself. I need to think about us, Grant." He lowered her voice. "I feel like we haven't been good for a while. Maybe once the paperwork's settled, we settle the rest too, don't you think?" And right there, Grant's suspicion died. Because a man planning to discard his wife needs more than anything to believe his wife suspects nothing. And Maggie had just handed him exactly that story, the sentimental woman who mistakes signing away a robbery for a gesture of reconciliation. The girl who signs the land away, believing she's buying love. Grant's shoulders relaxed. He smiled at her with a false tenderness that weeks earlier would have wrecked her, and that now only confirmed she was on the right track. "Of course, honey," he said. "Go visit your aunt. Rest up. I'll take care of everything here." He took her hand across the table, that rough pruning hand he'd always asked her, without saying so, to hide. "You'll see. Everything's going to work out. Everything's going to work out," Maggie repeated, and squeezed his hand back warmly, while inside, far away, very still, she finished sharpening the shears. That same afternoon she called Laura from out in the vineyard, walking between the rows so no one would overhear, phone against her ear, her other hand brushing the leaves, the way you'd stroke an animal before a storm. It's happening, she said. He wants me to transfer the land, and I told him yes. There was a silence on the other end. Mrs. Sinclair, Laura said, cautiously. I warned you not to sign anything, and I'm not signing the transfer, Maggie said. She stopped at the end of a row where her father's land ended and the sky began. I'm going to sign something else. I need you to draw up 3 documents, counselor, and none of them can leak. I'm listening. 1. The divorce filing. I'm not fighting for the winery. Not the brand, not the accounts, not the city condo. Let him keep everything in his name. I'm waiving any community claim, whatever there is. I don't want $1 of his. Ma'am, you're entitled to. I don't want anything of his, Laura. Nothing that comes from his hand. Write it that way. Make it clear I'm not taking a payout to leave. That I'm leaving clean. Another kind of silence. The silence of an old attorney who's seen plenty of women fight for the house, and very few understand there are things worth more than the house. All right, Laura said. 2. The revocation of the use agreement, Section 7. I want it ready, signed by me, dated, but left blank to be delivered the day I decide. 90 days for the winery to vacate my land. And 3. Maggie looked toward the farmhouse, toward the barrel room, toward everything her husband believed was his and was standing on her father's land. 3. You keep in your safe, and I hope to God I never need it. It's everything about the bank transfers. 14 wires to Bishop Creative Group. The filing where Camille shows up as a partner. The forensic report confirming that money came out of the household account, which is community property, to fund the affair. Her voice didn't shake. I don't want it for revenge, Laura. I want it in case, once he understands he's lost the land, he decides to fight dirty. If he comes after me, that folder ends him for fraud. It's my insurance. Not my knife. Laura took a while to answer. Mrs. Sinclair, she finally said, in 30 years of practice, I've seen everything. Women who go quiet and die a little at a time, women who scream and lose, and very, very few who do what you're doing. A pause. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. With everything you have, you could destroy him. The land, the fraud, the affair. You could put him in the street and in a courtroom. Why not? Maggie crouched down, took a handful of her father's soil, let it fall through her fingers. Dry, alive. The one thing in 13 years that had never betrayed her. Because I don't destroy things, counselor, she said. I make wine, and to make wine, you don't rip out the whole vine. When part of it goes bad, you cut away the bad, keep the good, and wait. She wiped her hand on her jeans. He rotted on his own. I'm just going to stop holding up the rotten part. Whatever falls after that falls under its own weight, not by my hand. She hung up and stood at the end of the row with dirt under her nails and the sun going down, feeling, for the first time in 13 years, in complete silence with nobody in the world aware of it yet, like the sole owner of her own life. The weeks that followed were the hardest, not because of what had to be done, but because of what had to be faked. Maggie had to keep being every single day the girl who always signs. She had to sit through breakfast across from Grant and ask about the brand with fake interest. She had to let him stroke her hair with that landlord's tenderness. She had to smile at Camille when they crossed paths at the house, and say good morning with a calm that cost her every letter, knowing the girl had a key with a pink sea charm and a reserved spot in a life they were planning to build on her father's land. The hardest part wasn't the contempt. She was used to contempt by then. The hardest part was the fake affection, because at least the contempt was honest. The affection wasn't. One night, she nearly lost everything. Grant walked into the study unannounced while Maggie was reviewing papers by lamplight, Laura's papers, the revocation of the use agreement half read on the desk. Maggie didn't startle. That was years of training finally paying off, not startling. With a steady hand, she slid the page that would have sunk her under a barrel catalog and left in plain view on top some cork and label invoices. Barrel room accounts, she said without raising her voice much, looking over the new label options. Grant came closer, glanced at the labels over her shoulder, with the disinterest of someone who delegates that kind of thing. The gold one looks more expensive. He put a hand on her shoulder. Glad you're getting into all this, honey. I like seeing you busy. Keeps you distracted. Yes, Maggie said. It keeps me distracted. He squeezed her shoulder and walked out. And Maggie sat there, with her hands still steady on the barrel catalog, listening to her husband's footsteps fade down the hall, and only once she heard his bedroom door close did she pull the page back out from under the catalog and see that her hand now was shaking a little. A small tremor, the size of a loose screw, which she clenched the way she clenched everything, and kept reading. She learned something that night her father never taught her, because her father was an honest man and never needed to know it. That patience when there's danger isn't standing still and waiting. It's moving slowly with a bomb in your hands, smiling while the other person doesn't know the bomb exists. She sent Laura's papers somewhere safer that night, not the house, back to the safe at the Santa Rosa office, and kept only copies in her memory, because what you carry in your head, a curious husband can't find at midnight. And she counted the days, the ones left until the signing, the ones left until she could stop pretending. The signing was set for a Thursday at a title company office in downtown San Francisco. Grant arranged everything with the quiet enthusiasm of a man watching his plan close in on the finish line. He booked the large conference room, called in his attorney, and out of habit and vanity, invited a couple of business partners along who were also due to sign a capital increase the same day. And he invited, without telling Maggie, his mother, because Eleanor wanted to be present the day the vintner's daughter finally got her affairs in order, meaning the day she finally stopped being in the way. Maggie arrived on time, in a simple dress, hair pulled back, carrying a worn leather satchel that had been her father's, which Grant didn't recognize because he never noticed old things. "You look nice," he told her in the hallway, and said it surprised because it had been a while since he'd looked at her long enough to notice how she looked. "Thanks. A little nervous," she smiled. "It's strange signing something this important." "It's not important. It's a formality." He tucked back a strand of hair that wasn't out of place in that fatherly way of his. "In half an hour, we'll be at lunch, and nobody will even remember this. Then you go to your aunt's, you rest, and when you're back, we'll talk about us." "Yes," Maggie said, "yes." And they walked into the room. Inside was Grant's world in miniature. The long, polished table, the title officer, a gray-mustached man who'd notarized half the fortunes in the city without ever asking where the money came from. Grant's attorney with his folder and his pen, the two partners, and at the far end, sitting very straight in a bone-colored suit with her hands folded over an expensive handbag, Eleanor, who, watching Maggie walk in, tipped her head slightly with the satisfaction of a queen attending a subject's abdication. Maggie, the mother-in-law, said, "So glad you came to your senses. I always knew you'd do the right thing. Good morning, Eleanor." They sat. The officer arranged the papers. Grant's attorney slid the transfer document across to Maggie, the same page from the San Francisco office, now in its final form with seals and signature lines. "It's simple, ma'am," the officer said. "Here you transfer the rights to the Calloway Ridge parcel to the company. Sign here, and initial in the margin. Your witnesses and I certify." He held out the pin. "Any questions?" Maggie took the pin. Across the table, Grant leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't smile. Men like Grant don't smile at the moment of winning. They save the smile for later, for the mirror. But something in his shoulders let go. Something loosened the tension of 18 months of planning, about to close with one signature. Maggie looked at the page, looked at the pen in her hand, and in the silence of the marble room, with the wall clock marking the seconds, she set the pen down on the table. "Before I sign this," she said, her voice clear, no tremor, "I have something else to submit for the record." The attorney frowned. "Ma'am, this is just the transfer. Nothing else is on today's agenda." "There is now." She opened her father's leather satchel and pulled out, one by one, 3 folders and set them on the polished table in front of everyone, with the calm of someone setting the table for a dinner she'd been planning a long time. She slid the first one toward the officer. "The original deed to the Calloway Ridge parcel. In my name, Margaret Elizabeth Calloway, inherited from my father 12 years ago, 1 year before I married, under a separate property regime." She looked the officer in the eye. The land this transfer says I'm giving to the company was never the company's, never my husband's. It's mine, 100%. I'm asking you to verify it before we go any further. The officer took the deed, put on his glasses. Red and Maggie watched on the old man's face that even though he'd notarized half the shady fortunes in San Francisco, he still knew how to tell a real document from a sealed lie. He raised his eyes slowly and looked at Grant with a silent question Grant couldn't answer. Second, Maggie slid the second folder to the center of the table. The use agreement under which I, the landowner, loaned the property to the company 8 years ago free of charge. Section 7. Revocable with 90 days notice, no cause required. She set another page on top. And this is the revocation signed by me dated today. The room had gone into a different kind of silence than before. Grant straightened in his chair. Something started happening in his jaw, the look of a man hearing a noise in the engine and not yet sure how bad it is. Maggie, he said with a laugh that came out fake, what is this? What are you talking about? I'm saying that as of today, Grant, the clock starts. A 90-day clock. His voice didn't rise a single degree. At the end of those 90 days, Sinclair Sellers has to vacate the Calloway Ridge parcel. The house, the barrel room, the vines, everything's standing on my land because it's my land and I'm not lending it out anymore. The attorney grabbed the papers with quick fingers, read them, and as he read, his professional face, trained to show nothing, showed something. The paleness of a lawyer suddenly understanding his client sent him into a signing without telling him the ground was shifting under everyone's feet. Mr. Sinclair, the attorney said low urgent, did you know this parcel was in your wife's name? Grant didn't answer, and his silence answered for him in front of the two partners, the officer, his mother, everyone. Yes, he'd known. Of course he'd known. That's why the transfer. That's why the rush. All his pride, his whole kingdom, every magazine that had ever printed the vision of one man, all of it standing, and he'd always known it. On land, the woman he called the girl who doesn't understand paperwork was lending him for free. Eleanor put a hand to her chest. This is an outrage, she said in a shrill voice. This is a betrayal. After everything this family did for you, what this family did for me. Maggie looked at her and for the first time in 13 years held her mother-in-law's gaze without looking away. Eleanor, your family brought a last name and painted it on my door. The land was my father's doing. The wine was made by these two hands, the ones it embarrassed you to see stained. You people didn't do anything for me. You lived off me and thanked me for it by calling me the girl. The silence now was total. There's a third folder, Maggie said, and she didn't take it out of the satchel. She left it closed, rested her hand on the leather flap, and looked at Grant directly for the first time all meeting. I'm not putting this one on the table, she said. This one stays in my attorney's safe. Inside are 14 wire transfers, Grant. $61,000 you pulled from the household account over 18 months into a company called Bishop Creative Group. There's a filing where Camille Bishop Cross appears as a 15% partner. There's a forensic report proving that money was community property and you used it to fund your girlfriend. An exact pause. That's fraud. And if you'd let me sign that transfer, I'd be walking out of here today with nothing, and you'd have kept the land, the brand, and her. But you spent 13 years treating me like I was simple. And simple women, Grant, are sometimes the only ones who read the fine print all the way to the end. She put both hands on the table and stood. I'm not going to use the third folder, she said. I don't care about sending you to prison. I don't care about taking your dirty money. I'm not going to fight for the winery or the brand or the city condo. Keep everything that's in your name. She picked up her satchel. I'm keeping what was always mine, the land and the one thing you never learned how to make, even though you slapped your name on it. The wine. Grant stood too, and for the first time in the room, his voice lost its polish. It cracked into something raw and ugly. The panic of a man watching the ground open up. Wait, can we talk? Without the land, the winery, without Calloway Ridge, it's nothing. The distributors, the contracts, it's all tied to that parcel. You know that. You putting me out on the street. No, Grant. Maggie slung the satchel over her shoulder. I'm leaving you exactly where you started, with a good suit, a business plan, and a smile. That's what won me over 13 years ago. Let's see if it's enough to start over. She turned toward the door. Oh, and sign whatever you want today. The capital increase, whatever else. It's not my business anymore. I came to sign one thing, and it wasn't the thing you thought. She walked toward the door. The girl knows which side her bread is buttered on, Eleanor spat at her back, voice cracking, playing her last card of contempt. Without us, you're nobody. You're going to starve. Starve with your land and your wine and your pride. Maggie stopped at the door. She didn't turn around fully, just tilted her head enough for her voice to reach clearly across the room. Eleanor, she said, the land feeds the person who works it. I work it. She paused. You people just signed for it. You never knew where your bread came from. That's why you're going to miss it so much. And she walked out. She didn't slam the door. She closed it slowly, carefully, the way you close the door of a house you've already decided not to return to. And the soft click of that door weighed more on the marble room than any shout could have. Behind it, Grant Sinclair's whole world understood all at once in the most expensive silence of their lives that the woman who'd just walked out wasn't the one they'd believed they'd been holding up for 13 years. She was the one who'd been holding them up. Out in the hallway, Maggie walked toward the elevator without hurrying, pulled out her phone, dialed. It's done, she said. I filed the revocation. The 90 days start now. She listened for a moment. No, I didn't use the third folder. Didn't need to. Another pause. Yes, I'm fine. I'm very fine. I've never been better. She hung up. The elevator arrived, the doors opened. Maggie stepped in, and in the mirror at the back, she saw herself, hair pulled back, simple dress, her father's old satchel on her shoulder, and her hands, her pruning hands, steady, not shaking. The doors closed over her reflection, and for the first time in 13 years, going down 30 floors in San Francisco, she felt like she was rising. Maggie spent the 90 days at Calloway Ridge. She never went to her aunt's. Of course, there was never an aunt's house, or a reconciliation, or a rest. There was instead a move in reverse. Instead of her leaving, they left. Grant tried the first few weeks everything a man like that tries. He called, he pleaded in his own way, which was still a way that sounded like a command. He sent his attorney to propose buyouts, land swaps, new partnerships, where he generously offered Maggie a percentage of what was already hers. He even sent Eleanor, who showed up one afternoon at the farmhouse with a box of chocolates and a humility so fake it practically fell out of her hands. Maggie received all of them with the same steady courtesy. She offered coffee, she listened, and she told all of them the same thing without raising her voice. The land isn't for sale. It's not up for a swap. It's not to be lent. It says so right on my father's old box. Not for sale, not to be lent, not to be given away. Eleanor was the first to climb down from the pedestal. She showed up one afternoon with a box of caramels and a smile that no longer fit her face. Maggie's sweetheart, no longer the girl, now sweetheart. I came to talk woman to woman. This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Grant is impulsive, you know that. That girl didn't mean anything. A silly mistake, a grown man's foolishness. She put the box of caramels in Maggie's hands like an offering. Family fixes things. Come back, sign what needs signing, and this is all behind us. And I'll make sure that Camille never sets foot here again. Maggie set the box of chocolates down on the table. She didn't open it. Eleanor, she said, for 13 years you called me the girl, the vintner's daughter. You made me feel at every dinner, every holiday, that I was lucky to have married your son, that I brought little and got a lot. She spoke without bitterness, with the calm clarity of someone who no longer needs anything from the other person. And now you come, calling me sweetheart and bringing me chocolates? You know what changed, Eleanor? It's not that your son cheated on me. That doesn't matter to you, and honestly, it doesn't matter to me anymore either. What changed is that now everyone knows whose land this is. She stood. You didn't come here to make peace with me. You came to make peace with my parcel. Take your chocolates and give Grant my regards. Eleanor left without the box and without a word, and that was the last time she ever set foot on the land she'd spent 13 years looking down on. Grant came later after it was already too late once the rented facility in Santa Rosa had taught him what it meant to make wine without the ridge. He came alone, no lawyers, no mother, and that was maybe the one dignified thing he did in the whole story, coming alone to lose. Maggie found him at the end of a row, shears in hand. "I dropped the price on the new vintage 3 times," he said, without greeting her, staring at vines that weren't his anymore. "And it's not moving. Distributors keep asking about the ridge, just the ridge. Frank told me straight to my face he buys from the land, not the label." His voice cracked. "I'm losing everything, Maggie." Maggie didn't stop pruning. "I know. Could you help me?" "A deal. Sell you the brand. I handle distribution, you handle the land. We go back to—" He stopped. Even he heard it. "We work together as partners." She cut a dead cane, let it drop to the ground. "Grant, in the barrel room a few months ago, you told Camille I sign whatever's put in front of me, that it's my way of feeling loved." He looked up for the first time. "I heard you, that whole night." Grant went white. "And you know what? You were right. I signed everything out of love, out of fear, out of habit." She went back to the vines. "Not anymore. Now I read. And what I read, Grant, is that a man who calls his wife a tool doesn't deserve to be her partner, her husband, or to set foot on her land." She pointed with the shears toward the gravel drive. "You've got 41 days left of the 90. Use them to take what's yours. What's actually yours. What did you bring with you?" "Nothing." Grant opened his mouth and closed it. There was no business plan for this. No smile that would work. He turned and walked down the gravel toward his car, and for the first time, he was the one who left without looking back, though in his case, it wasn't dignity. It was that he had no face left to look back with. And once they understood it was real, they stopped coming. Grant moved the winery within those 90 days. The brand, after all, was still his. The distributors, the contracts, the name in the magazines. He hauled the tanks, the barrels, the equipment to a rented facility outside Santa Rosa, far from the valley, far from the fruit that had made him famous. He could still make wine there, just not that wine. Never that wine again, because the wine that had made him celebrated didn't come out of a rented warehouse or a business plan. It came out of old land, out of vines a man had planted on his knees 40 years earlier, and out of the hands of the woman who'd tended them her whole life. Both of those things, the land and the hands, stayed at the ridge. With her. Camille didn't last long. Women like Camille fall for the visionary man in the magazines, not the man renting a warehouse on the outskirts of town, and discovered too late that his genius was borrowed. Once Bishop Creative Group stopped receiving wire transfers because there was no more household account left to draw, from Camille understood, with the same coldness she'd understood everything else, that the chair she'd been sitting in didn't lead to any table anymore. She left, chasing the next fortune, the next label, with the same cold face. Maggie didn't learn any of this through gossip. She learned it from Ernie Walsh, who stayed on with her in his little office next to the barrel room, balancing the books of a new winery that would no longer be called Sinclair. Because that was the first thing Maggie changed. One day, well into the 90 days, she climbed a small rise where she could see the whole property, the stone farmhouse, the cypress trees, the green rows running down toward the horizon, her father's land, whole under the sky, and decided the name right there. She wouldn't use her married name. That wasn't hers anymore. She wouldn't call it Calloway either, even though that was the first thing she thought of, to honor her father. She thought better of it. Her father hadn't put his own name on the land. He'd put a word, the same one on the label of the box on the deed, on everything he considered truly real. The Ridge. That was the name, the one it had always been, really the one Grant had used as the name of a vineyard inside his brand, never understanding it was the name of everything, of the place, of the beginning of things, of where a person comes from and, if they're lucky and have the nerve, manages to find their way back to. The first harvest under the new name came out the following year. It wasn't easy. Maggie had to learn everything they'd never let her learn: the distributors, the pricing, the permits, the whole world of good suits and firm handshakes that Grant had kept her out of precisely so she'd depend on him. She learned the way she learned everything, with her hands and with patience, making mistakes, starting over. Laura helped her with the paperwork, Ernie with the numbers, and the people of the valley, the ones who actually made the wine and never showed up in the magazines, helped her because they'd known her all her life, and they knew the way small communities always know who had actually made that wine and who had only ever sold it. She didn't get rich overnight, but she didn't starve either, the way her mother-in-law had shouted at her in that conference room. Quite the opposite. The first vintage of the Ridge now, with its true story behind it, a story wine writers sniffed out fast and told with relish, sold out before it was even bottled, not out of pity, because the wine had always been good, and now finally it carried the right name on the label. Grant Sinclair kept on existing, it has to be said, because real life isn't a story where the villain vanishes. He kept a brand, a rented facility, a modest wine that no magazine put on its cover anymore. He kept signing things in offices around the city. But something in him had broken that doesn't get fixed with a business plan. He'd built his entire idea of himself on the certainty that he was the one who mattered and she was the one who depended on him. And that certainty had come apart in a conference room in front of his mother and his partners in the most expensive silence of his life. A man can recover from losing a piece of land. It's harder to recover from discovering at 49 that you spent your whole life looking down on the one person who was holding you up. Sometimes people in the valley said he'd drive slowly along the road that passed by the ridge. He'd slow down at the cypress trees. Look at the stone farmhouse, the Rose, the arch a mason and 2 mules had built. And keep driving. Maggie never knew it, or if she did, it didn't matter to her, because at that hour she was usually out among the vines, with shears in hand, doing the one thing she'd always known how to do, the one thing that had never betrayed her. A year after the conference room, on a winter morning, Maggie was at the end of a row pruning. It was her favorite hour, the light coming in sideways, frost still on the ground. She cut the dead canes carefully, the ones that wouldn't bear fruit again, so the sap would go entirely to the good buds. Her father had taught her that work before anything else. Prune well, my girl. It's loving the plant more than you love this year's crop. It's cutting what hurts so there's life next year. Ernie came up the row slowly with his 74-year-old walk, an envelope in his hand. Kiddo, this came from the attorney. Maggie wiped her hands on her jeans, took the envelope, opened it with her pruning knife. Inside was a single page. The divorce final, signed, sealed, done. She wasn't Mrs. Sinclair anymore. She was once again, in every document in the world, Margaret Calloway, who she'd always been before a man in a good suit painted another name on her door. She read it standing among the vines with the frost melting around her and didn't feel sadness. Didn't feel triumph either, if triumph is that loud thing people celebrate. She felt something quieter and larger. She felt what land feels when someone finally lifts off the weight that had been keeping it from breathing. She tucked the page in her pocket. Ernie, she said, you remember what your dad used to say about this row, the first one Robert planted? How could I not, kiddo? That it was the stubborn one, froze first, budded last, that he was going to rip it out 1,000 times, and 1,000 times he thought better of it. Why didn't he? The old man smiled, missing a few teeth on one side. Because, he said, the stubbornest vine makes the best wine. That what has to fight to survive survives stronger. He looked at her. He was talking about you, kiddo. Even when he was talking about the vine, I always knew he meant you. Maggie looked at the old row, the stubborn one, the one that froze first and budded last, and finally understood the whole inheritance. Not the land, not the wine, the lesson buried in both of them. That what's truly worth something is almost never what shines on the label. It's what holds on underground, quiet, unwatched, until the day it's needed. She picked the shears back up. Come on, Ernie, she said. We've still got half a row left, and these vines don't prune themselves. and she kept pruning her hands cold and steady on her land under her name, while the winter sun climbed over the ridge and lit everything in a color no magazine had ever managed to photograph. Because it wasn't in the stone farmhouse, or the cypress trees, or the label. It was in her.